What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 198. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined today by Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
I'm great, Cal. How are you?
Great, Connor. Good to have you back on. And you have a brand new article out today at the Libertarian Institute that everybody should check out. Shoving match. Biden pushes around China and Russia, and we'll certainly be talking about China and Russia today, but as almost becoming like a weekly segment here, Connor, you're going to be talking about Iran and what's going on with the talks and everything, and then we will get into some news on China and Russia as well. So I think we'll have a lot of important stuff today. Everybody's going to want to hit the share button on the show, so find it at the Libertarian Institute, along with Connor's articles, my roundup, and then again, the show is featured on the homepage right under, I think, Free Man Beyond the Wall, or Scott and Pete's news show, End of the Empire. Either way, right hand margin, find conflicts of interest and go ahead and hit the share button for the show and everything. Also, all the information for how you find the show on like Facebook, Twitter, MeWe, Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, all that is in the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute. So if you want to subscribe on whatever different platform, you can find all that information right there. You can also find where you could donate to the show, either through Patreon or Subscribestar. And we also take crypto, and that information is in the show notes page. Another way to support the show, and also in the show notes page right there, you'll find the link to our great sponsor, Paloma Verde, the URL, palomaverdecbd.com. The promo code is PEACE, PEACE. That will save you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. They have a ton of great products at Paloma Verde. I really love their topicals. I talk about them all the time, but I don't take enough time to mention that I do really like the soft gels, especially at times of the year when I tend to get headaches because my allergies are worse. I haven't had to deal with that for the past couple of months, but I know it'll be coming up in the spring, and I want my soft gels of Paloma Verde's CBD soft gels, especially the ones combined with curcumin, absolutely excellent for headaches. But whatever you got going on, there's probably something that can help you at Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, let's get into the show, and I'm not going to give you much of a lead in here. We had the 7th round of talks happen last week in Vienna between the European parties in Iran, with the U.S. stationed at a separate hotel down the street. And after they met, they went to the U.S. and kind of had a back and forth that way. So what happened at the meeting, and what are the prospects for saving the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, so so the Americans were over at the Marriott next door. I'm blanking on the exact name of the other hotel, but it's where the original deal was signed. And so basically what happened was Iran came forward and as we'll get into it here, but they basically demanded that all sanctions be lifted, not just the ones that the Americans want to lift, which are, they claim are inconsistent with the JCPOA. Ali Bagheri Khani has been very forthright and articulate in explaining that, look, even when the deal was originally in place under Obama, the sanctions were not really lifted. There was no comprehensive implementation, and he says that one of the main problems then was that they didn't have a good enough mechanism, a suitable mechanism to verify the sanctions relief. So what they are demanding is not only for the nuclear sanctions that are so-called inconsistent to be lifted, but also the sanctions that Trump imposed in regards to their conventional weapons, and namely their missile program, their ballistic missile program. There's still quite a few sanctions, and in fact, you could argue, as we'll get into it here, that Congress, or it's certainly a group of bipartisan congressmen, are attempting to expand further sanctions on Iran for drones, because they blame Iran essentially without evidence for the Houthis' attacks on Saudi Arabia, of course absolving the Saudis for their genocidal war in Yemen, which has provoked the response and the reaction from the Houthis and their drone attacks, which of course the propaganda is that these drones were provided by the Iranians, which is ridiculous, of course, because the country's under blockade. But that's one thing we'll get into get started. But I'll just say that they also want to have lifted the sanctions that are also for over terrorism, their support for their allies, and their so-called, human rights violations and these other things. So that is really where the discrepancy is. They also want to guarantee still that the Americans will not leave the deal, and which Biden has refused to grant them. And so hence that's why Blinken and frankly the other hawks basically are claiming that Iran isn't serious about the negotiations, when I would argue that they in fact are. It's really the Americans that are unserious about this. So we'll get into it. If you want, we can start with. I'll just start off with So we left off the last time we discussed the Iran deal. We were talking about how the Israelis were on a diplomatic blitz, essentially trying to sabotage, the negotiations by claiming immediately on Monday, the day they started, in the Israeli press, they were saying that they had warned the Americans that Iran is planning on enriching uranium to 90%, which is, weapons grade, to build a bomb. That I think they said they were 6 months away. We had Yair Lapid, the foreign minister of Israel, traveling to Paris, to London and then to Paris, essentially saying the same thing, calling for more sanctions and even a credible, as he said, a credible military threat against Iran to deter them. So then the next day, Iran came out. We had the foreign ministry spokesman, Saeed Khatibzadeh, come out on Twitter and say that the Israeli regime, whose existence relies on tension, is at it again, trumpeting lies to poison Vienna talks. All parties in the room now face a test of their independence and political will to carry out the job, irrespective of the fake news designed to destroy prospects for success. So, basically, Iran came out and said that the Israelis are clearly trying to sabotage the talks. And then we had further threats from the Israelis. We had Benny Gantz, the defense minister, coming out and saying that attacking Iran must always be an option for Israel, even if they have to act alone. Said, I do think we always have to prepare the option for the moment when we may find ourselves alone, he said to an Israeli newspaper. I say again, an attack against Iran is an option. It doesn't have to be the first one. And of course, the background on all this is that Israel has resumed their drills, practicing bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. Their government just approved a $1.5 billion boost to the military budget to explicitly prepare for an attack on Iran. And all year we've had the head of the IDF, Aviv Kohavi, saying that he's going that the IDF is accelerating their plans to attack Iran. And also, I should just add that there have been threats from Israeli officials going back to before Biden, shortly before Biden even came into office, that if the U.S. decided to return to the deal under Biden, that Iran would go ahead and attack Israel unilaterally. And the implication, of course, is meant to pressure them not to, because of the threat of a huge regional war that would result, of course, out of all of that. So we had Blinken coming out on Thursday saying that I think in the very near future, the next day or so, we'll be in a position to judge whether Iran intends to engage in good faith. He's basically saying he's not optimistic about the talks, that he doesn't think Iran is serious. He says, I have to tell you, recent moves, recent rhetoric don't give us a lot of cause for optimism, but it's not too late for Iran to reverse course. Now, what's interesting is, as Dave DeCamp points out in this article here at antiwar.com, you had at the same time Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, writing on Twitter that a good deal is within reach. He says a good deal is within reach if the West shows goodwill. We seek rational, sober, and result-oriented dialogue. And also at this time we had Al Jazeera reporting that despite kind of the hyperbolic rhetoric from the Americans that basically that they're walking back on all their so-called commitments they made in the previous rounds of negotiations in Vienna from April to June during when Rouhani was still in power. That's actually not true, that the Iranians have proposed 2 draft proposals dealing with the sanctions they want to see lifted, and also another paper on another draft, I should say, on what their obligations would be, rolling back all of their nuclear expansion and walking back to their commitments under the deal. And then if those 2 are agreed on, which they already shared those with the Europeans, since, as you said, talks have been paused, we still are waiting to hear the response. They want a third draft that would provide the groundwork or provide a guarantee itself that the Americans would not withdraw from the deal again. But what's interesting is you see a lot of this stuff where they're saying that Iran is walking back on all of its commitments they made. And the Iranians are very upfront, and they say that, look, nothing was officially agreed on. And so nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed on. All this stuff is still up for negotiation. In fact, they dispute that there was ever anything really concrete in those agreements to begin with. I have some quotes in Middle East Eye about this because it continues to come up. We have U.S. officials, as we see here in this Reuters piece, coming out and basically saying, like what I just said, that Iran is being underhanded, that they are walking back and trying to gain extra concessions from the Americans. But really, they're trying to spin it this way. But I mean, they claim that China and Russia are taken aback by how far Iran has walked back its proposals. But I actually think that's untrue because I don't think you or I have been surprised, following this this issue for a while at what Iran is requesting, and their nuclear program is it's completely monitored by the IAEA. So and all these reports constantly come out, so that the idea that China and Russia were not aware of what Iran is demanding at the talks, and what they've been saying they're going to demand at the talks for a while now, or of their nuclear advancements, just sounds like nonsense to me,
Yeah.
from this anonymous official.
And one thing I didn't understand either, Connor, was did the American side just expect that everything was going to be the same? I mean, I don't think the Iranians would assume that, like, after Trump left office and Biden came in, that they were dealing with the same exact administration that would make the same exact deal. That's absolutely absurd. And so that, they're mad that they didn't pick up where Rouhani left off. Well, too bad you didn't buy the deal when you had the chance, which is what everybody was saying all along. Like, hey, the best chance you're going to have to get the deal done that the Biden administration is going to like feel best about and be easiest to sell with, the hawkish, it's going to exist no matter what. Even top Democrats like Bob Menendez are going to blast the Biden administration if they get into any kind of deal with the Iranians. But at the very least, had they done it with the Rouhani administration, that I think it would have worked out a little bit better and been a little bit easier. Now that Rossi's in, it's a little bit more of a hardline administration. Yeah, it's gonna be harder to get a deal done. I mean, this is what everybody knew all along, and that they're acting surprised by it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, and then the only thing I could really see the Iranians asking for that would be maybe absurd, because the hardline government has talked about this more, is economic compensation for the sanctions because Trump backed out of the deal when the Americans were in it. So have you heard anything about the Iranians asking for, I mean, what could be multi-billions, if not trillions of dollars? Trillions is probably too much, right? I mean, it was a huge part of the Iranian economy that took a massive hit. And I guess depending on how you calculate too, whether, they missed the projections versus just the shrinking of the economy. But either way, it was a massive blow to the Iranian economy.
For sure, and the Iranians have made it clear as far as that compensation stuff. I have not heard more on that, but I do know that they are refusing to entertain this idea that has been talked up a bit in the press and by Jake Sullivan, and apparently with his counterpart, the Israeli National Security Advisor, that this idea that there would be a less for less so-called less for less interim deal, where basically the U.S. would issue waivers for humanitarian aid and unfreeze certain assets in exchange for Israel rolling back, say, the enrichment of 60% of uranium to 60%.
Iran.
For Iran doing that. Now, Iran is their position is that that's out of the question, that they're not entertaining that, nor are they entertaining this longer and stronger deal, which would the Biden administration during the talks with Rouhani was trying to force them into agreeing and committing to discussing or negotiating rather their ballistic missiles and their regional alliances, and basically making sure that the success of the deal ultimately would hinge on those talks. So Bagheri Khani, who was the lead negotiator, says that Iran is deadly serious about negotiations, and he highlighted the fact that they have 40 top officials with him in Vienna, including the head of Iran's central bank. And he says they're not considering the less for less plan, and they were not contemplating the JCPOA plus. So let's see. They also say that the ball is in America's court, clearly, because America is in violation of international law, UN Resolution 2231, which relates to the JCPOA, and they're the ones that pulled out of the deal in the first place. They also say that in this Middle East eye piece, it says that the Americans are insisting on Iran's full compliance, and the reduction in the number of centrifuges, their uranium stockpile, their stockpile of enriched uranium, and that, like I said, that they're only going to lift limited sanctions, and they keep insisting that they. Basically, they're committed to Rouhani's agreement to negotiate limited sanctions relief. But as you said, Raisi's government is not going to do that. So as far as the talks, according to this Middle East Eye piece, like the actual talks themselves, they got off to kind of a rocky start. So it says that Middle East Eye understands that a European country upset the Iranians by reading out a statement drafted by Robert Malley. And the Iranian delegation protested that the Americans aren't here and don't threaten us. So then it says that the European country then backed down and assured the Iranians that direct statements from the American delegation would not be read again. Then the Europeans then lambasted Iran's, so-called intransigence, and apparently the head of the Chinese delegation highlighted the West's hypocrisy in regards to nuclear proliferation, pointing out what is going on in the Pacific with the AUKUS deal, how America and Britain are providing the Australians with nuclear submarine technology to make nuclear submarines, which is, I believe, those subs use uranium that's produced. It's like 93% enriched uranium, so highly enriched uranium, weapons grade stuff. So that's why one of the reasons why I doubt these claims that the Russians and the Chinese are basically on the same page as the Americans, that they're flabbergasted at these advances, and that I think that. Because the Americans are also, as Dave points out in his pieces here at antiwar.com right now, they're now reporting that the Americans are really going to try and press the Chinese to cut off their oil trade, stop buying oil from the Iranians. And I don't see that happening. In fact, basically, that's one of the main reasons why that's a vital lifeline for Iran's economy. And I know that as far as Russia goes, Raisi contacted Putin in a phone call before the talks got started, and he supports Iran's demand for a guarantee that the Americans will not leave the deal again. And as we've seen even last week, when the Americans and the Europeans were censuring and calling out the Iranians at the IAEA Board of Governors meeting, it was the Russian envoy who stood up for the Iranians and said that this is ridiculous. You're pressuring the Iranians, and we know that the Iranians will not, the Iranians don't respond well to pressure, and that this is unprofessional, and basically that the Americans were in the wrong. So let's see. We also know that, so as far as the stuff that there's this, they've agreed to previous things with the Rouhani negotiations. Ali Bagheri Khani said that draft is full of brackets and it's not an agreement, and that he's not aware of any interim deal that was tabled by the Americans. He also said that that they've been in constant. They're not talking about regional involvement with the Americans, which has actually been a long-standing Iranian policy, that they don't want it. They are happy to enter into these regional talks, as we've seen, and we'll talk about warming ties with the UAE now, which I think is a really good sign. Considering the UAE.
One second on the sure. On the TOTS, one thing that happened during the TOTS that HOTS made a lot of hay with was that Iran apparently turned on some upgraded centrifuges. Yes. And they were saying, oh my God, look at the Iranians using the cover of diplomacy to advance their nuclear weapons program. And don't you just know they're going to have a bomb in 2 weeks to kill Israelis with?
Yeah, you and I were talking about this when these reports came out Wednesday, that it's very possible that the Israelis had intelligence that they knew that this was going to be revealed soon. So they, started out by kind of overhyping it to the nth degree by saying that they're preparing to enrich to 90% and that they're going to use that as leverage, which was ridiculous. As I said on the previous show, that if they actually did that, it would tank the talks for good immediately. So it would make no sense for Iran to do that. And what actually happened was that they I believe they call them IR7 centrifuges. So they've built more effective upgraded centrifuges at their Fordo site, and they're enriching uranium to 20%, which is, as we've discussed, it's the same level of enrichment that they use for the Tehran research reactor. They have, a uranium tetrafluoride enriched to 20%. They convert it to fuel plates, and then they use that to produce medical isotopes for, I believe, 1 million patients who need nuclear medicine in Iran. And of course, they're supposed to be able to acquire the fuel without having to go through all this trouble. But the reimposed sanctions and basically the dishonesty on the part of the Americans has precluded them from doing that. So, and again, also this policy of enriching to 20% was demanded by Parliament initially anyway, because the Israelis killed Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November. They're scientists. So, and Jason says that the American diplomats are trying to spin this enrichment as an attempt to gain leverage. And he says, but the process of upgrading the centrifuges was ongoing long before the talks were even scheduled. This is just, he says, almost certainly coincidental. That Iran is allowed, of course, as we know, to continue to upgrade their centrifuge technology and replacing their old machines, many of which, of course, have been sabotaged by Israel with new and better machines. He says it's perfectly natural. And another thing I picked up, actually, because we've discussed this at length about the IAEA and their complaints that, they're not letting us replace the cameras. Well, the Iranians actually have accused, and we were talking last week also about their, so-called, basically they were being accused of searching, IAEA inspectors in a kind of a hostile way, like inappropriately demanding they remove articles of clothing and things, and that they thought it was kind of aggressive or unprofessional. But the Iranians actually believe that it's possible that the footage obtained in those cameras was used it was involved, let's say, in the attack on Courage when Israel attacked their centrifuge building site back in June. At the end of the talks. So that's another reason. I mean that they've accused the IAEA of previously doing some things that were underhanded, like possibly contaminating
so
sites.
What they're saying is that that the IAEA had surveillance and
right.
the Israelis somehow got their hands on it, and that was used in part for the Israelis to attack the Courage facility.
That's what it says in this one of these reports. I think it might even be this one about in Middle East Eye, and also that's another reason why, as we know, that they've demanded that the IAEA condemn Israel for the attack, and the IAEA has refused to do that. I think it's because they have obviously Israel has this massive secret nuclear weapons arsenal that possibly includes hundreds of weapons. So I don't think the IAEA really wants to get involved in any of that. So, but that's been a major point of contention, of course. Let's see. Yeah, they say they claim. So it says, since then, Iran has refused to allow the IAEA inspectors back into Courage to reinstall cameras damaged in the explosion, claiming the footage obtained was used to prepare the attack, a claim vigorously denied by the IAEA. But that's interesting that the Iranians, that is something that they suspect actually happened. So as far as the talks themselves, that's what I have right now. I'll say that, there was it looks like Iran's currency saw a bit of a boost when in recent weeks, because the talks were about to resume. But after Blinken came out and said that he doesn't think Iran is serious, and that, all basically him sort of towing, I would argue, the Israeli line, because he got this call from Bennett saying, he was reiterating his nuclear blackmail talking point, where he says that they're engaged in nuclear blackmail. You should immediately halt negotiations, and the world power should implement tough steps And then Blinken came out the next day and said, let's see, I'll get the quote exactly. Said, what we've seen the last couple days is that Iran right now does not seem to be serious about doing what's necessary to return to compliance, which is why we ended this round of talks in Vienna. We're going to be consulting very closely and carefully with all of our partners in the process itself, and we will see if Iran has any interest in engaging seriously. The EU diplomat, though, who's chairing the talks, Enrique Mora, he says that they just took the weekend off so that the envoys could return back to their respective capitals and consult with their governments. So this is, I mean, on that basis, I think this is more U.S. propaganda. Let's see. So and as Dave says here, he thinks what Blinken is demanding is that they stick with the limited sanctions relief, and of course they're not going to offer that. It doesn't look like they're going to offer that guarantee that they won't leave the deal. And I'll just say so that the Iran's currency now, the value is going back down after it looks like a deal might not actually happen. As Jason Ditz reports here at antiwar.com, he says the U.S. Let's see, having rebounded. So it dropped over the weekend as a result of the talks, not looking like they're going in any positive direction. And now we do know that the Israelis who are doing their best here to sabotage the progress. We know that Benny Gantz is headed to Washington with David Barnea, who is the head of the Mossad. Now, they're headed to Washington this week. I think you and I were saying that they may be coming Thursday. I'm not sure exactly what day, but their whole thing, it's being reported in Israeli by Israeli TV broadcasters that they're going to push, here's a familiar term, for the U.S. to develop a plan B on Iran that involves harsher sanctions and military action. It was ridiculous on its face because they go, we don't want. It says in the reports that they're not going to demand or encourage an attack necessarily on Iran's nuclear facilities, but they would like to see an attack on so-called Iranian bases in Yemen, which, of course, as Dave points out in this report on Israeli officials urging the U.S. to attack Iran, he says there are no Iranian bases in Yemen. And also, Barnea, the head of the Mossad, is expected to tell the Americans that Israel is going to continue their covert attacks on Iran, even though there's a building consensus in Israel even that I mean, and the Americans, of course, it was reported in the New York Times, I believe last week or maybe the week before, but we covered it last week, that the Americans told the Israelis to stop those attacks and saying that they're counterproductive because, as everybody knows, though, Iran just responds by increasing their enrichment or their stockpile or building more advanced centrifuges, which is their right, and they're trying to induce substantive diplomacy on the part of the Americans and stop these attacks. And now I will say, because now we know that the Israelis were going to come here and start saying, of course, the usual script about how the Iranians are building a bomb and you should stop talking to them and implement more sanctions and get a lot harsher with them. Even the Israeli president is saying, all options are still on the table. In fact, Blinken said something like that as well last week when he said he doesn't believe the Iranians are serious. So it's a lot of that same rhetoric. But now William Burns of the CIA came out and said that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon. He says there's no evidence they've decided to do that. He told the Wall Street Journal's annual CEO Council, according to the Times of Israel, that the CIA, quote, doesn't see any evidence that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has made a decision to move to weaponize. And as Dave DeCamp says here, he says Burns' comments counter the Israeli claims and could be a sign that the U.S. might be breaking from Israel on the issue. So I think that's actually very good news. Also, as far as this stuff about, I was suspicious of how much truth there was to this idea that the Russians were on the same page as the Americans, because it seems to me like they're supporting Iran in these talks. And I wonder if they'll be even more supportive now, because Israel on Monday night bombed Syria again, in the area where most of Russia's operations are based in Syria are based out of, in Latakia. So there was loud explosions heard and fires started in a shipping container yard. So as far as I can see so far, there haven't been any deaths reported and the fires have been put out. But as Jason Ditz says here in this report from antiwar.com, he says Russia has warned Israel away from the Syrian coast many times. We discussed, I think, a month or two ago that the Russians had basically given the Israelis free rein to bomb Syria, but with the understanding that they should stay away from this particular area where the Russians have a lot of assets and a base. So. But obviously that's not what they're doing here. So this is a major provocation. We'll have to see how this plays out. Ordinarily, the Russians don't do much to discourage Israeli attacks. They used to complain about it, and then there was a brief moment where I think Israel stopped attacking Syria for like a month in this past summer, and then they picked it up again. And then I think the pace of bombing actually increased to the point where it wasn't just weekly; it was often more than once a week. So. Now,
And
another
I
thing.
think
Oh,
that's a major Syrian port too.
yeah.
So this is if somebody like bomb like the port in Oakland or something like that. That's big. Even if they did hit like a shipping container that had weapons in it or something, that is still bombing a civilian port.
Yeah.
That's a pretty provocative move.
I saw
Uh,
some stuff on Twitter as well from people who had video out of the area saying that it was actually food even that was being damaged. I didn't exactly confirm that. I just saw the videos and some of these claims from people in the area. But I mean, I'll be looking into that, and that may be the case as well. Like you said, it's a major port, and they always claim that they're hitting even when they're not. They always say, "Oh, it's Hezbollah, arms shipments and these sorts of things." So there's reason to be suspicious of that, of course.
So I want to ask you about this because one of the bigger things that happened throughout everything and got some of the least media attention of anything else is that during all of this, the UAE top security official traveled to Iran for talks, and so I don't know. This seems to be a sign maybe that at least the Emiratis think the deal might be coming around, and they want to make sure at least that they're going to be on decent terms with Iran. I'm not sure. What do you think about all this?
I think I think it's a very good sign. So Ali Bagheri Khani traveled to Dubai uh, to meet with senior officials from the Emirates in late November, just before the talks. And he said, and I read in the other report in Middle East Side, they said it was a very, very good meeting. And following those meetings, Bagheri said that they had agreed to, quote, open a new chapter in bilateral relations. And this seems to be more evidence of that. So we've talked before about how the Saudis and the Iranians are getting closer and closer. The Iranians have resumed exports to Saudi Arabia. Baghdad has brokered a series of talks between the Saudis and the Iranians. There was that major meeting of a bunch of different heads of state and foreign ministers in Baghdad that Trita Parsi reported on a couple months ago for responsible statecraft. And this national security advisor, Sheikh Tahum bin Zayed al Nahyan, um, who is the brother of Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the de facto ruler of the Emirates. He's the crown prince of Abu Dhabi. He was involved extensively in those talks, in these various meetings, because it was basically the point of Trita's piece was basically that as the U.S. moves more towards, pivots more to Asia, whether or not that's as substantive as the regional actors seem to believe, it's still, that's the way it's interpreted, that they are actually serious about really moving most of the assets and focus to East Asia to focus on China, or alternatively Eastern Europe and Russia. And that they are kind of moving on beyond the Middle East, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the removal of various missile systems like the Patriot missiles out of Saudi Arabia sent clear messages. At least they were interpreted as such, that the Americans really do intend to kind of move on from the region to a large extent. So we saw tons of different regional actors, especially long-term adversaries like the Turks and the Emiratis beginning to talk with each other again, or the Saudis and the Iranians for that matter. So this seems to be a part of that, because the UAE, of course, are the first state to be brought in is under the Abraham's Accords, these sort of stage managed, faux normalization deals with Israel, where the Arabs decide to throw the Palestinians under the bus in exchange for major arms deals with the Americans, and the Emiratis case, it was they were getting Reaper drones and, I think like 14,000 different munitions and
F-35s.
F-35s. Yeah. So, but now they are talking with the Iranians. And so this report from Al Jazeera says that when Sheikh Tahun first, he gets to the UAE, gets to the capital, he meets with Ali Sham. Or excuse me, when he gets to Tehran, he met with Ali Shamkhani, the secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, and then he met with Ibrahim Raisi, the new president. And according to the Iranian readout of the meeting, Shabkami said that Iran's main focus in foreign policy is developing warm and friendly ties with their neighbors. He emphasized that countries in the region should not be affected by external influence and meddling, and they must work to end military and security crises through dialogue, not military action. He hoped that Tahun's visit would, quote, mark the beginning of a new chapter of relations and create grounds for expansion of all ties. Then Sheikh Tahun was quoted saying the UAE also wants to improve warm and brotherly ties with Iran as a geopolitical power. And he said that the two countries should form working groups now that identify potential areas of boosting economic, transit, energy, and health sector relations and remove possible obstacles that could get in the way. So those are very good signs. I would say, and I think we'll keep an eye on that and see if these talks continue in the same way that the talks with Saudi Arabia have. And also, that's a big deal because the Saudis came out and said essentially that they would support they said explicitly that they would support the JCPOA if it prevented Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which everybody knows it does. So it's starting to look, I mean, even if even the Gulf states are starting to support or at least warm ties with Iran, it looks like it really is Israel and the Americans that are the ones who are in fact intransigent, not the Iranians like they try to portray the situation.
Yeah, there's a couple more news stories on Iran I wanted to touch on really quickly. I did see that at least talks are planned to restart on Thursday, Connor, of this week, so that could be good if those move in a positive direction. It's good that they got something on the table. Just today, I caught this from Voice of America putting it out, and that is the U.S. has imposed a new round of sanctions on people from Iran, Syria, and Uganda, citing human rights abuses. This is in celebration of Biden's democracy summit, so nothing says celebrating democracy with your allies like waging economic wars on countries that are, really struggling to manage, COVID and other things, going on, a lot of suffering, from other things, especially in Syria. But anyways, one of the things that was incredible about this is some of the sanctions on Syria are because they allege Syrians are involved in chemical weapons attack, which Aaron Mate continues to do more great work debunking. He has another good piece out. I think he's putting together a series. He's got part 1 and 2 out now on the Syrian chemical weapons attack in Duma that I recommend people check out if you haven't gotten to that yet. And then, of course, the sanctions on Iran, Connor, at this time are completely absurd. They sanctioned 2 Iranian police agencies and some heads of those agencies, and with the talks going on in Vienna, and this being a real chance at diplomacy, I don't know, it seems like such a slap in the face of the supposed message of Biden's summit, which is to promote democracy, not just making deals with other countries, but honestly, doing deals seems to be a part of following the international world order and all of that. And I don't know, it seems far more provocative than, say, the Iranians installing the upgraded centrifuges as planned, and the United States rolling out these new sanctions, especially when they already sanctioned 24 Syrians and a couple Ugandans. It's not like they needed also to sanction Iranians, or they wouldn't have anyone to sanction. So anything else on Iran before we wrap this up and move on to China?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just point out Trita Parsi has a great piece he put out on MSNBC that talks about how basically he's saying that the Iran deal, his forecast is that it's going into what he calls the coma option, which is essentially the deal will be dead but nominally alive, and that may be the most preferable option at this point for almost, well, certainly he says for the Americans, the Iranians, and even the Israelis, he argues. So I'll just go through this really quick. So he says that, as I said, that there's a growing consensus in the Israeli and American security among American and Israeli security officials that the covert attacks are counterproductive. He even cites quotes from Blinken and Robert Malley from 2019 and 2015, where they basically said that they know that this strategy of imposing imposing increasing sanctions on Iran does not actually work. In fact, let's see, Robert Malley said in 2019 that it was a fantasy that the maximum pressure campaign would somehow lead Tehran to agree to more stringent measures. And he said he quotes even Blinken in 2015 saying that it was a fantasy to believe Iran will simply capitulate to every demand if we ratchet up pressure even more through sanctions. So they know absolutely that is not working, that it's just needlessly aggressive. But what Treater really gets into is that the other option, of course, you would say is probably a war. It's it seems like that's been what the Israelis have been pushing, at least for the Americans, to fight for them. As the saying goes, that they're ready to fight Iran to the last American. But it really that would be such a disaster in the region. It would really hurt, even just from a pragmatic political standpoint. If you just remove the morality of it, it would really hurt Biden's political prospects for re-election in 2024, or Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg or whoever's running in 2024. They've tried to push. He even points out the absurdity that after they left Afghanistan, it's the first time the U.S. isn't at war in 20 years. So, I mean, that is probably not on the table. If America was going to go to war with Iran, they were pushed to do it, and there were hawks that really wanted to do it in the Bush and Obama and or during the Obama years. Certainly in the Bush administration, Cheney was a real hawk on Iran and was trying to get basically toward the end, especially, it seemed like a war started, and there was major attempts to get Trump sort of sucked into a war by Bolton and Pompeo and Netanyahu, and so that has not happened. Thankfully, cooler heads have prevailed, and it doesn't seem like that would really change with Biden. But he says that, politically as well, returning to the deal would be a major problem for Biden's administration. Just getting to return to the deal would cost him so much political capital, especially when he's trying to move through all of his domestic economic policies right now. The hawkish Democrats in Congress are not going to support him return to the deal unless it's the Israelis' dream deal and this longer and stronger kind of thing. And as he points out, that even if they did return to the deal, which is unlikely, that in 2023 there would have to be a major fight that many in the White House are not going to want to do anyway, where they would have to basically square up with Congress and basically fight over the fact that then sanctions would have to be lifted in 2023, right on the eve of the 2024 election, which would, again, be a real political problem for Biden. And then he discusses how, as we've talked before, the Iranians can't trust the Americans in the first place, so they don't want to cede all their leverage and then get stuck with new sanctions and threats of war. And of course, if America returns to the agreement, they can then use in the Security Council the snapback mechanism and reimpose all JCPOA sanctions, which the Trump administration would have loved to do but was not able to do. Now, he says that the Iranians are obviously aware that Western companies, international companies, and investors are not going to enter the Iranian market unless they have confidence that the next Republican won't just rip up the deal again in 2024 if a Republican takes office. He quotes France's former UN ambassador Gerard Arud, who tweeted last Friday that even if the JCPOA is restored, no Western company will dare invest a cent in Iran. No Western bank will finance any deal in Iran. The threat of a return of U.S. sanctions in 2025 with the threat of a return to U.S. sanctions in 2025 once was enough. The Iranians know it. So he says as well that an EU diplomat told Trita last week that they'll never admit that the JCPOA is dead. Tehran may choose to go that route anyway, because that way at least they can keep their leverage while strengthening ties and economically and otherwise with Moscow, Beijing, and any other governments that are willing to defy U.S. sanctions. He does talk about, he says the wild card is Israel. Of course, he says Bennett, opposes Iran deal, a U.S. return to the agreement, any diplomacy in Vienna. He opposes the interim deal. He opposes the status quo. But he says that even Israel might prefer this situation as opposed to an unpredictable intensification of the conflict, because, of course, there's a great article right now at Responsible Statecraft that talks about how Israel, their Air Force alone, is nowhere near doesn't have anywhere near the capabilities to take on Iran, even just attacking their nuclear sites. There would be, there's major missile defenses. They have their missile program, of course, which would be able to shoot down planes. They'd have to take out command and control centers and communication centers. They have nuclear facilities scattered, around the country. So it's not as simple as, bombing Iraq's Osriak reactor the way they did in 1981, or when they bombed the Syrian reactor in 2007. It's obviously it's a much larger program. It's not just one target that they can just pick off. So they would have to drag the Americans into it, and they're not. It doesn't look like they're going to do that. And I think that's pretty obvious. Hopefully, as this big sign of that is Burns coming out and saying that they're not seeking a weapon, which would, for most people, and especially the Americans, this is thankfully worked in the past. It basically means that there's probably not going to be a war. A similar situation happened in 2007, where there was a national intelligence estimate that threw cold water on all this hype when it looked like we may be headed to war with Iran. So he says, assuming Iran doesn't expand its program too aggressively and the U.S. maintains sanctions that keep Iran's economy weak, Israel might just go ahead and accept this. They'll still probably sabotage Iran's program, but with less, as he says, spectacular attacks that Iran can probably deny are happening anyway. So it's a horrible status quo, but it looks like it's very possible that may be what happens anyway. But I have some hope, considering the Americans are coming out and now basically debunking the propaganda of the Israelis. So who knows where maybe there's an internal battle, because I think Blinken is one of the worst on this, and that if they wanted to return to the deal, he would be leading the charge on that front. But he seems to be one of the worst, and ironically, the Israelis don't even give him any credit for it. There's all kinds of reports where they put out anonymous officials who call him a leftist, which is a joke, and they say that he's trying to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel. So it's hard to figure all that out, but it does look to me, I think Trita Parsi's hypothesis is most likely true.
Yeah, the only question I would have for Trita would just be, with the sanctions on Iran really hurting the economy, would the U.S. have to provide some kind of sanctions relief? Or, even if the U.S. continued to put on sanctions like they did today, but at least maybe not enforce sanctions, or really back off trying to enforce sanctions that are going to China or something like that. Oh, one last thing on sanctions in Iran I'll mention before we wrap up here. The Iraqis got another sanctions waiver from the United States to continue to import energy from Iran. And so, it's this really strange thing where all the time the U.S. is constantly like, if you do business with Iran, you're funding terrorism. And then the U.S. proxy state in Iraq, or not really, but the U.S. built state in Iraq that is not an American proxy, because of the way the actual voting works in Iraq makes it so that there's Iraqi nationalism and Iranian influence and all that in the government. But anyways, this government that the Americans built are completely reliant on Iran for energy. And so even though they're constantly fear mongering about all the money that Iran gets, they're not concerned about this money going to Iran, partially because, maybe as Ted Galen Carpenter points out, the situation in Iraq is pretty bad, and this is even seen now in Iraqi Kurdistan, where a huge number of the people showing up on Belarus's border are from Iraq. And it's not because Lukashenko put them on first class flight and sent them there and was like, go to the EU. It's because they want to leave Iraq because conditions there are bad.
And it seems like there's at least reports are showing that there's a new sort of ISIS campaign in Iraqi Kurdistan right now as well.
Yeah, well, very interesting how suddenly all these reports of ISIS attacks bubble up as the Americans are supposed to be changing their mission in Iraq after this month. But it was reported that I think ISIS took 2 villages near Kirkuk, Iraq, and has carried out a series of attacks that left I don't know, 15 to 20 people reported dead. And this is Iraqi Kurdistan, so northern Iraq. And then today there was a bombing with a motorcycle, I believe, in Basra, which is southern Iraq, a heavily Shia populated area. And while ISIS, at least as of the recording of this show, hasn't taken responsibility, has hallmarks of an ISIS attack, and the governor of the Basra province, or wherever that is in Iraq, a higher ranking Iraqi official blamed ISIS for the attack. But
Yeah, there were other attacks that they weren't immediately claiming responsibility for in Kurdistan. I think last week I saw Jason reporting about that at Antiwar.com and saying it was very odd that they wouldn't do that because they ordinarily do pretty quickly after.
Right. All right. Well, interesting what's going on in Iraq, and maybe I'll get to that on the show next week. But let's move on here and talk about the U.S.-China relationship, where, Connor, we have the Olympic Games coming up, and I come to the, anti-war foreign policy angle probably a little bit like you do, guessing from that picture over your shoulder there. From Ron Paul, who always talked about, let's play baseball, let's play sports. That's the way it should work. I remember Rocky IV, he goes to Russia and gets the Russians chanting not Russia, for the Soviet Union, and they all fall in love with him. And so the Americans and everybody, we go to China and we kick ass, and then the Chinese are like, screw this communism, we want capitalism, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. I'm joking a little bit, but at the same time, it is an opportunity for diplomacy. We saw this with like the 2017 games in Korea, where they came in under one banner, and if it wasn't for Trump really screwing that up, that could have been a real moment where we could have had a more peaceful situation on the Korean Peninsula. And so again, these Olympic Games should present an opportunity for some kind of diplomacy to break out, but the Americans are making sure that doesn't happen, and the Biden administration has gone ahead and said they will have a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games. Now, I don't know if the U.S. has diplomatically boycotted Olympic Games in the past. What this actually means is that no U.S. officials will be in China on official business. I don't know, if this means, if Marjorie Taylor Greene really wants to stick it in the eye of Biden, I think she could still go to China. I don't think, Biden could do anything to stop her, but it wouldn't be like an official government business or anything like that. And so the U.S. says that the reason they're doing this is because of the human rights violations going on in China. And of course, they cite, threatening Taiwan and Hong Kong. But the main portion of it is the alleged genocide against the Uighur minority Muslim population, which we recently went through and debunked on this show. So I'm not going to do it here again today. But if you're interested, be sure you're listening to the show, because I can't go through and do all these myths every single time, but they largely manipulate data and rely on the work of this kook Adrian Zenz in order to fabricate a genocide allegations against the Chinese government, when really they're just talking about a decline in birth rates, and there's other explanations for that. Now, with the Americans boycotting, the Australians have already jumped on board and will also be diplomatically boycotting the Beijing Winter Olympics. And so we're probably going to see a few more countries jump on board before we get to the end of this. Of course, China is upset, and they said that they will take retaliatory countermeasures, but didn't lay out what those were. Now, I do want to clarify that the U.S. said that they're still going to support the athletes going towards China. And so, Connor, to me, this really reeks of just like a pure political move, where the U.S., rather than taking, the probably harder approach as far as U.S. politics goes, which would be to go to China and try to get some diplomacy done with like an official delegation or something like that, they're making sure the Americans still have their bread and circuses. We'll still get to see our athletes go and perform and all that. And so, you would think that like having some guy like, do the curling would be kind of trivial if there's a genocide going on. But, the U.S. athletes worked really, really hard. And so we got to make sure we still support them going to China.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of it is to walk the line where it's the politically most advantageous, where, you get to sound like you're taking a real hardline approach with this diplomatic boycott, but at the same time, nobody has to really lose anything as far as entertainment value goes. I mean, the world loses a potential for diplomacy, but that's it.
Yeah, I saw Jen Psaki say, "But we'll be cheering our athletes on from home," and it's the even, it's just embarrassing. Yeah, they're committing a genocide, but good luck, everybody. We hope we win. So yeah, it's purely political and just very predictable, unfortunately.
And then I do want to mention New Zealand also said that they were not sending any officials to the Chinese Olympic Games, but said that that was because of COVID. And because it is New Zealand, I tend to believe that could be the case. They've taken pretty strict COVID measures, and it seems within the realm of possibility that they would do that for that reason. We want to talk about hypersonic missiles, where we have everybody in the U.S. government warning that the U.S. is in an arms race and losing to China because of hypersonic missiles. This is Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall recently saying that China and the U.S. were in an arms race with again, hypersonic missiles, but not necessarily for increased numbers of those missiles, but increased quality. This is, of course, the case. These things are going to carry nuclear warheads. You don't need a million of them, but you do need them to be able to function. And so that's kind of what's going on there. It's really not a surprise. Now, another thing happening, Connor, is we have the Reagan National Defense Forum, which I think CNN has a big role in. They're hosting panels and stuff like that. And of course, we have a non-biased mainstream media here. And so when they put together a panel, it's, General David Thompson, who's the second in command in the Space Force. And then it is the chairman, a CEO of a defense contractor, and a congressman who's the head of the Armed Services Committee. So there's no dissent in here whatsoever. They don't have somebody from the Quincy Institute or William Hartung or even from a Defense Priorities PAC or anything like that. This is simply a Warhawk summit, and they certainly took the opportunity to do that. General David Thompson, who I talked about on the show last week, hawking it up on China, is going at it again, saying the fact is that in essence, on average, they're building and fielding, updating their space capabilities at twice the rate we are, means that very soon, if we don't accelerate our development and delivery capabilities, they will exceed us. And so, this is one of those things, Connor, where the military always goes, oh my God, Russia and China are catching up to this. We have to do so much more. We need so much more funding and everything. We need to build all these new weapons. When, the way I look at it, if the U.S. military is outspending the rest of the world, not the rest of the world, but certainly any of our enemies in the world combined, and then, particularly Russia, we're outspending them by 3 times, Russia by 10 times, and then we're losing to them in these technical capabilities. I mean, that sounds like David Thompson should submit his resignation letter, right? How are you this much of a screw up and a loser that you have 3 times the amount of money than the other opposing military, and they're commies. They're stupid, ridiculous commies, and you're losing to them? Are you serious? What is wrong with you? And that is not at all the take. It's, oh my God, look at our general saying they need more money, and we just got to shovel it at them. Biden also gave a speech at this Reagan Forum, and this was one of the bigger speeches that he has given since the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in this speech, he declared America is a Pacific power, which in one sense has been true since World War II, when the U.S. went through. And I mean, I guess you could even go back to the Spanish War, when we claimed the Philippines. But we have the Marshall Islands, Guam, Okinawa, and all these other bases and everything everything all over the Pacific Ocean. So this is kind of true, but it also in the same time seems like an official declaration from the United States that yes, the Pacific Ocean, at least up to the first island chain, which is only a couple hundred miles off of China's border, is an American lake, and we are going to treat it as such. So I thought that was, the big takeaway from his speech. He said a lot of like mumbo jumbo about, literally about, the hypersonic weapons, like saying that China is going to have increase their capability to have more capable hypersonic weapons, is about the quality of what he was saying on that issue. And I'm not even exaggerating that much with that statement. So
yeah, no, I've got the quote. I think he said, "I would just point out the hypersonic capability is a capability, but certainly not the only capability that the PRC has the capability to develop. And my job is to focus on the broader picture and make sure we can defend ourselves against any and all threats."
Right. And then just the last thing he mentioned in this speech that I think is worth talking about, and that is saying that the policy and strategy now for dealing with China is called integrated deterrence, which relies both on strengthening work with allies and partners in the region and pushing U.S. technology industry to keep ahead of Chinese innovations. And the reason I thought this was very interesting is the Department of Defense just published a article on their website that was basically calling for the DoD to be more involved with private companies developing tech. And they say the problem is that the private sector gets the tech first. So, that this company develops something for the 330 million people in the United States and the 9 billion people on the planet. But the Pentagon says what we really want is for these tech companies to develop products for the Pentagon first. And so this could really curtail the quality of U.S. made tech products if this happens. And, with the major Chinese Competition Act that they're trying to pass in the Senate, that's a $250 billion bill. I think this is a big part of the Biden strategy, is to try to get in with the private sector and, to work with them to build technology against Russia. We also had at that conference, Representative Cooper saying that the military can't keep up with the private industry in space, and was like lamenting the advances made by SpaceX and whatever Jeff Bezos' company is, Blue Origin or something. And yeah, I mean, again, this should be an indictment of like the failures of the military, but rather, it's just an excuse to shovel more money at them. Connor, I want to move on and talk about some threat inflation dealing with China. We have the claims from the U.S. military, or intelligence, and report by, I believe, the Wall Street Journal first, that China is seeking its first military base on Africa's Atlantic coast. Now, as there's a great article coming out today, Wednesday at antiwar.com by Daniel Larison, where he points out that they say that this is going to be the Atlantic Ocean opposite the U.S. East Coast. And if anybody has ever looked at a map of where the U.S. is on the globe compared to where Africa is on the globe, for the most part, Africa is in the southern hemisphere and the U.S. is very much in the northern hemisphere. And so, no, Equatorial Guinea is not opposite Washington, D.C. And also, if they did happen to have one simple naval base in, Equatorial Guinea, that would not give China some kind of ability to target the United States in any unique kind of way. And so there's really no threat here, but the United States, and particularly our mainstream media, are making a very big deal out of this. And again, look forward to that article by Daniel Larison at antiwar.com, breaking down just how much of a joke this is. There's this interesting article from Axios here. Huawei sanctions snarled chip supply chains, and a big conversation in the United States right now, especially for anyone trying to buy a car, is that there's no computer chips around and that there's a big shortage of them. And what this article lays out is that when the United States put sanctions on Huawei, it produced which is a major Chinese tech company, it produced a major reaction from them that had twofold effect. Firstly, Huawei sucked in most of the component supply to help its smartphone business survive for the next 12 months. And so when Huawei was sanctioned, and they bought up all the chips that they could and all the manufacturing, you know what I mean? They needed to make sure that they weren't cut off from the global supply chain. And so they made sure they had as much of the raw material as possible. And that in turn pushed other mobile competitors to do the same thing, which left companies that don't use computer chips quite so heavily, like the automotive industry, now in a lurch. And it's, you know, very interesting how all this happens, Connor, where, you know, the U.S. thinks we're punishing China, but now really who's being punished more, the Chinese or the Americans trying to buy cars?
Yeah,
Let's
all these policies are totally counterproductive and always hurt the Americans. There was that reporting, I think Mike Swanson was talking about in a recent piece he had on China, where they kind of let the cat out of the bag in a New York Times piece where they're going, look, a lot of these big bills that Biden is pushing, like the, you know, the infrastructure bill, a lot of it is framed in this way of like, well, we've got to do this to compete with China. And you're seeing these like $1 trillion bills, and they're saying that this is, in many ways they haven't been able to pass things like this, you know, these mass scale industrial policy kind of bills in the modern era without you know, previously. But now when they use China as the big boogeyman, everybody's so eager to prove their bona fides, that they're as anti-China as the next guy, that it gains you know, support. And like you said, of course, if you look at even the tariffs, Trump's tariffs, it cost hundreds, I believe hundreds of thousands of jobs to Americans. So these policies, and then of course we're spending more in the military than we ever have before. So all this stuff about competing with China, it makes us, as you were mentioning Ron Paul earlier, would point out, the first point I was, make us much less competitive, and it only ends up hurting us much more.
All right, Connor. So maybe the most provocative thing that the U.S. has done towards China in the past week is a U.S. official traveled to Australia and said the AUKUS alliance could welcome more countries into its partnership. The reason that this is so concerning, Connor, is that the AUKUS alliance shares nuclear technology and nuclear power submarines between the U.S., UK, and Australia, as well as increasing other ties. But you know, the nuclear submarines and the technology that comes along with that are seen as particularly provocative by not just China, but also North Korea and other countries in the region. And they're talking about expanding that to more countries. I can't imagine that they could actually be talking about like giving the Philippines this kind of technology. And so I'm guessing we're talking about JCPOA a thing here and adding Japan to it, but you know, maybe they could be talking about more European nations or something like that. But this is, I'm sure, definitely raised some pretty major red flags for China. We also had in November a record number of U.S. Flights in the South China Sea. They say there were 94 of them in the month of November. And just to understand how much of an uptick that is, previously, and I believe me and Connor have actually talked about this on the show in the past, that in February, the U.S. carried out a record number of flights. But this was a 25% increase over that February number. And so it's not like the previous record was 90 and we're now talking about 94. You know, we're talking about a significant increase in flights. A lot of these flights were carried out by the Poseidon, P-8 Poseidons. These are anti-submarine drones, I think, that fly around and attempt to detect, you know, where the Chinese drones and all that are submarines, excuse me, are. So, you know, very interesting that all this is coming out, and I'm sure China sees it as very provocative. We also had China last week carry out 27 planes flew into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. This week we have 4 Chinese planes make that flight. Notably different this time was the route that those planes took. Typically they're flying just through well, not just through, but you know, significantly through the southern part of Taiwan's ADIZ. This time it was a very brief incursion where they, you know, flew through the corner, but they didn't also fly towards the, what would that be, eastern portion of the ADIZ as well. They stayed well to the south west of the Taiwanese island. And so I'm not sure, maybe China wasn't trying to provoke so much with these flights, and I'm not exactly sure, what they're reacting to, but it's probably the massive number of U.S. Flights in the South China Sea. Now, the U.S., we're just carrying out these 94 flights in the South China Sea, Connor, because that's what we do to enforce the global international order. But China, when they're carrying out these flights through Taiwan's ADIZ, which, as we've talked about and broken down the phone on the show in the past, is not in any way airspace. It's very far away from the Taiwanese island. But Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is claiming this could be a potential rehearsal for an attack on Taiwan, which, at least if you look at like what kind of flights we're talking about and everything, doesn't really seem to be the case. Now, they could be doing things like testing Taiwan's defenses and seeing how long it takes for Taiwan to respond and how they react when they do start maneuvers or something like that. But to say that this is a rehearsal and not also look at it in context the amount of U.S. flights that are going on is absurd and really doesn't put this into context. The last thing on China generally is more about Japan here, as the U.S. and Japan are talking about how much the Japanese will pay for the U.S. soldiers that are deployed to Japan. The U.S. is looking for Japan to pay more. Japan has agreed to this, but has not agreed to how much more they will pay. And so, Connor, it does seem like this is going to go a little bit more smoothly than it went in Korea under the Trump administration, when it was a complete disaster for several months and they were laying off Korean employees and everything like that. Connor, anything I missed on China that you wanted to mention, or anything you got to comment on?
I think you covered just about all of it. Oh, we know that Austin just met with the defense minister of South Korea, and they put forward that statement about for the first time. I think it. I'll have to double check, but I think it's in decades and decades, like since the '60s, probably, that where they issued a joint statement about Taiwan, saying that they're committed to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, building off of some similar statements that were made. Between Biden and Moon Jae-in in May.
Yeah, and
So that's another major provocation.
This is a part of the U.S. reworking on their defense plans with South Korea, and they're now going to include defense of Taiwan as well. Connor, let's move on. Probably the most important thing going on in the world right now is the relationship between the U.S. and Russia. We have a lot of news, a meeting between Biden and Putin. So I'll get into a little bit of the stories that happened in the past week first, and then we will get into the actual video chat, the Zoom call we had between, I'm sure it's not actually Zoom, between Biden and Putin today. So
I'll just point out before we do really quick, just to correct myself, it was the first time Taiwan was mentioned in a joint release from the defense chiefs of the U.S. and South Korea.
All right. So the first story on Russia here, is new joint sanctions between the U.S., EU, UK, and Canada on Belarus here, and this is over, Belarus. They allege that Belarus is using, the migrants that are coming from Iraq in order to, they've called it terrorism or any number of things, some kind of asymmetrical warfare against the EU. Kind of crazy, Connor, where these countries will constantly grandstand on human rights and everything like that and get up on their soapboxes, but when it actually comes to welcoming immigrants, nobody probably works harder than the EU to make sure that they stay out. They spend a massive amount of money on drones and all kinds of other surveillance. They're willing to work with, the Libyan Coast Guard and any other very nefarious group to keep out the migrants. And so they're sanctioning now Belarus once again over that. We also have, I think, a very important story here. Russia saying that one of its civilian airliner, had to lose height to avoid a NATO spy plane. It doesn't sound like this was a close call or anything like that, but the NATO spy plane crossed about at the same altitude that the plane was flying at, causing the plane to have to take a somewhat drastic, I don't think like a nosedive or anything, but I'm sure if I were on the plane and, not being a very comfortable flyer, I would have been very uncomfortable with the plane having to drop the couple thousand feet that it had to drop because of the NATO spy plane flying in front of it. This is one of these things, Connor, that if the Russians or the Belarusians had done it, we would be crying international order. This is completely uncalled for. How could you do something like this? And when NATO does it, everybody completely shrugs, except, Russia, who's like, hey, what's going on here? Probably the biggest story on Russia in the past week that made the most headlines is from the intelligence community, saying that Russia is planning a massive military offensive against Ukraine involving 175,000 troops. And this was published by the Washington Post, goes off anonymous sources. And, I thought this, when you actually look at the details of this article, Connor, where they say that Russia actually only has 70,000 troops in the region, this is actually a walk back from what the other, U.S. allies have pointed out in the past, where the Ukrainians are currently alleging that the Russians have 94,000 troops in the region. Also, if Russia is planning an invasion with 175,000 troops, then only having 70,000 is less than half of that. And so they're really not that close to the buildup that they need. And it seems, really interesting that they put these numbers out and they do all this fear mongering, and, the media just reports it as scary. But if you actually read this and go through it, it actually suggests to me, Connor, that Russia currently isn't in a position to invade Ukraine whatsoever. And, that is something to point out with the current troops that they have in the region. Now, that was the first reporting on it. And then today we had CIA Director William Burns, yesterday, say that Russian forces could act in that way, but he doesn't think that, Putin has made that decision at this point. And so this puts the Biden administration in this really interesting position, Connor, where they get to pretend that, Russia is planning to invade Ukraine, but Putin could still change his mind. And, we could influence Putin to change his mind. And it's going to, they've essentially drummed up not a fake crisis, because there's a real thing going on here in Ukraine, but they've drummed up a fake scenario, and they're going to claim victory in that scenario, I think, like claiming they got Putin to bat down and decide not to invade Ukraine, when it's very possible that, in what I think is the case, that I don't think Putin really wants to invade Ukraine whatsoever. So we also had a Ukrainian military parade where they showed off a bunch of military equipment they had gotten from the Americans. And of course, when I look through all the American and Western press on this, Connor, you'll be surprised to know that this was kind of pumped up as a cool event and something like that, and in no way as it would be treated if this were, say, a North Korean or a Chinese military parade, where they would be, oh my God, Kim Jong-un is sitting on top of this crazy missile that he's going to launch at America any minute. That wasn't the case with the discussion on the Ukrainian military parade. I'm sure the Russians did see it as somewhat provocative, right? That they're parading around with all the equipment that they got from the U.S. We also had the U.S. last week announce that they were putting together a package that Biden says will prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. Now, I'm not exactly sure what this is, because in a sense, I could imagine that whatever package Biden thinks he could put together to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, like putting more weapons into the hands of the Ukrainians, could actually provoke a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't think sanctions would necessarily deter Russia from invading Ukraine if they were otherwise prompted to do so. So I think this is just like a propaganda package here. Now, my concern is that Biden is going to authorize the military, the CIA, or whoever else to come up with a bunch of options on what to do with Russia. And then those will just be sitting around in the future for things to look at and do. Now, it could also be, that they're talking about the package that I saw floated by the Latvians actually prior to the talks today. And they were saying that the U.S. and Western countries could expel Russia from SWIFT, sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and put U.S. troops into Eastern Europe, Although this seems to be a reaction to if Russia invaded Ukraine and not a way to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, unless they think merely the threat of doing this is enough to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, which I'm guessing is not the case. So, one more story here on Belarus, and that is Belarus says a Ukrainian military helicopter violated its border. I wanted to point this one out because this seems to be a place of real danger, right? Where you have Zelensky, who I think is a political neophyte and a little bit of a novice in Ukraine. I'm not saying that the guy is a complete idiot or anything like that, but he wasn't in politics. He was an actor before this, and what he talked about on the campaign trail doesn't really seem to match his policy as president. And he's really pushed things with Russia when I don't think he has anywhere to go. And Lukashenko, who's the leader of Belarus, and I think is a little bit of a, not a madman or anything like that, but he is a tyrant and, made some pretty big threats and everything like that. And so, we're also talking about the U.S. says all the time that we'll defend Ukraine and their territorial integrity. Belarus being a allied state to Russia, this is a very dangerous situation where miscalculations could really accelerate fast. And if you have a situation like with the Russian plane that drifted into Turkish territory, and Turkey ended up shooting that down in Syria a few years ago. Fortunately, there you have like Putin, who's a cooler head that could prevail, but I don't know if you quite have that if, let's say, Belarus shot down the Ukrainian helicopter, if Zelensky would feel the need to react towards Belarus or not, and exactly how far that all could spiral. So prior to the call between Putin and Biden today, Connor, we had each side kind of come out and say what they were hoping for, or what they would kind of what the main issue is. And the U.S. said that if Russia invades Ukraine, they're prepared to have more troops on Russia's border. That's the big one. And also put more weapon systems into Ukraine, and then new sanction packages against Russia. And then Russia has been saying that they want guarantees from the U.S. not to make Ukraine a NATO ally. And I think one very important point that Russia is trying to make right now is that is either in the de facto sense or in, just the actual NATO membership. So if, we're saying we're going to defend NATO, they basically have Article 5, we're putting troops and weapons into Ukraine as we would any other NATO state. That for Russia is going to be crossing the red line, even if we don't officially make Ukraine a NATO member. And that kind of made sense. And, Connor, I'm almost thinking that this current crisis in Ukraine right now really, resembles what happened in April. But it's almost like the Biden administration took what happened in April and said, okay, we won't make Ukraine an official NATO member. We'll just kind of make them a NATO member in everything but name. And Putin is saying, oh, no, we can't have that either. And this is also provoking Zelensky to act more aggressive towards Russia. So today we had a 2-hour video call between Biden. Did you see all who was with Biden, by the way? I saw Blinken and Sullivan, I believe.
Me too. There were two other people, but I couldn't identify them. It was a woman and then another man, I believe, sitting next to Blinken. And then it looked like Putin was, at least based on the pictures, by himself.
Right, and I'm sure there's like a translator or something like that. Or maybe Putin speaks enough English that, he could understand Biden or something like that. From my
They said Blinken was on the call too. It wasn't like they were just sitting there and kind of observing. Apparently, it sounds like it was Biden and his team in many ways. So.
Okay, so that makes sense. Now, there wasn't like an official presser between the two with the press after the call. I'm not sure how that will work on video call, but they could probably have made that work. But there wasn't anything like that. I think the Russians put out like some small statements that it happened, and then Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, gave what, like a 30-45 minute maybe press conference today, and took about 25 questions on it. And through that, I guess I've kind of compiled what I think happened. Now, the first thing I'll mention is that trying to compile anything from a press conference made up of almost entirely American press is very difficult to do. Almost every question asked to Jay Sullivan was completely stupid, and I don't think there was one question suggesting that the U.S. may be too hawkish on China, and every single one, but maybe one, was suggesting that the U.S. was not aggressive enough. Not towards China, towards Russia. And there were a couple questions in there tied in about the Iranian talks and stuff like that. And so he did confirm that, that they would be deploying U.S. troops to Eastern Europe if Russia invaded Ukraine, but said, of course, we already have a bunch of troops in Eastern Europe. And so, it's like, it just showed the press pool, like, thought that this was like some big new scary move from the U.S. And it was like, no, we already pretty much do that.
Didn't he say specifically which two countries they would be sent to as well? Sort of in a way, kind of making it clear without being extremely explicit about it, that they weren't saying they were going to send troops to Ukraine. Was it Romania that he said that they would be sent to?
I heard him say Romania. I wasn't sure if he was giving examples of just countries in Eastern Europe or if he was saying the countries. One thing about what Sullivan tried to say is that he was not going to repeat exactly the threats that Biden made to Russia because he felt like that would exacerbate the problem, which I do agree with. Like, I think that was probably a smart move, but I do think, maybe that was one way we got some of the details that would come out here.
There was also a disturbing quote he made that was provocatively ambiguous, where he goes, and I'll look you in the eye and tell you, like Biden looked Putin in the eye, he said, the things we didn't do in 2014, we are now prepared to do, which, that could mean moving more troops and equipment up to Russia's border and other countries, or it could mean sending troops to Ukraine. It's very up in the air, and that is, of course, very provocative.
Yeah, and that was actually, I believe, the third question that Blinken was at, which was one of the I guess more intelligent questions that actually showed some insight from whoever asked it, which was why will this work better than it did in 2014? Because you're essentially threatening Russia with the same things that you threatened them with in 2014. So why would this turn out any differently? And Blinken said, we're willing to do things we weren't willing to do, but then we're talking with our European partners, and I can't tell you exactly what we're talking about. And so it wasn't very helpful. He said that Biden did not make any concessions on the call. He said, there was quite a few questions around the Nord Stream pipeline, and there was one question that even involved Afghanistan. He said Afghanistan doesn't matter on this issue. When Russia, he says invaded Georgia, but when the thing in South Ossetia happened in 2008, without getting into all the details, the U.S. had a full invasion force in Iraq and forces in Afghanistan too. So obviously, forces in the Middle East wouldn't deter Russia from acting on its borders, that was one of the more sensible points that Sullivan made out of all that. Now, one of the points that he tried to make was that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was something that the U.S. and Europeans could use to leverage against Russia, and I'm not sure how much this is actually the case, but at least he does realize that there would be advantages to Russia to having this pipeline open, and economic ties are I guess kind of good things, is something that he's maybe acknowledging a little bit there. One of the best question that I thought was asked was like the 15th question out of all of them, was why did the Ukrainians initially play down the alleged Russian military buildup? And Sullivan couldn't give an answer to this, but I did think it was a very interesting question, one I actually have myself, which is initially when the U.S. said there was a Russian military buildup, the Ukrainians said no, the Russians are just moving their troops inside of Russia to different bases for training, which at the time at least, seemed to be what the Russians were doing. Now, since then, there's been a lot of provocative actions on different borders, and I think that has prompted Russia to have more of a troop buildup. And I think the Russians right now are in fear that the Zelensky government in Ukraine will actually move against the Donbass region. And
Yeah,
so
the
that's
Russians are saying they've sent about 120,000 troops, half of the Ukrainian army, allegedly up to the edge of the conflict zone anyway, near the Donbass.
right.
So it's possible that Zelensky, they like ratcheting up tensions to get more military aid and more support from the EU and NATO and the US. So it's almost like he was like, at first they're like, no, they're not doing, and then realizes the opportunity at hand and then seizes it.
Right. So there were a couple questions on the Iran talks, and I think we pretty much covered everything that was mentioned in there, other than Sullivan feeling like the U.S. and Russia were on the same page with not wanting Russia to have nuclear weapons or Iran to have nuclear
Yep.
weapons. I do agree with that. I think that is generally correct, although I don't know like how much the Russians are willing to work with the Americans on that issue, and I think they probably feel more solidarity with the Iranians and probably aren't willing to like help the Americans a ton on that issue. And then he did say that one of the things that Putin asked about was not to move NATO weapons further east. And at least, the Americans understood that that was something Russia was asking for. I'm not sure if that actually means that they're going to understand, because a lot of the rhetoric coming out of NATO and the Americans still is that the Russians can't tell us what to do on NATO. We'll put our troops where we want. We'll invite who we want into NATO, which is just a ludicrous statement that Russia can't have a sphere of influence that extends to the countries, at least some of the countries on its border.
How much of this would you say is related to the dispute over the anti-missile missiles of the sort that are in Romania and Poland? I mean, because when they say stop sending more weapons that threaten us on our borders, they're probably not talking about even the anti-tank missiles and the sort of things. Are they talking, do you think, about the helicopters? Are they talking about the Stinger missiles, the mortars, the new packages that are being proposed? Or do you think it's more of this sort of anti-missile stuff that can be anti-missile launchers that can be retrofitted with Tomahawks and reduce the Russia's ability to launch a retaliatory strike in the event of an American first strike?
So my guess is both, and for probably different reasons. If the U.S. gives the Ukraine more military equipment like Stinger missiles, helicopters, Javelin missiles, any other kind of arms, I'm sure Russia calculates, and probably correctly so, that that's going to embolden Zelensky and the Ukrainians and make it more likely that they would launch an attack on the Donbass, which would cause a real problem for Russia. The Patriot missiles, as you point out, are the anti-missile systems, and I think it's the MK-41 launcher that's made by Lockheed Martin that could also equip Tomahawk missiles, which, the U.S. is now willing to equip with nuclear warheads. And so putting that into Ukraine is a real problem for the Russians, and understandably so. I mean, if the Russians were putting, cruise missiles that could be armed with nuclear warheads in Mexico or Canada or Cuba, we would be losing our absolute minds. And I mean, this is, it doesn't really, like, if the U.S. capital was Austin, Texas, and Russia was putting these in northern Mexico, that's the comparison that we're talking about right here. Just understand that, this is close to Moscow. This is close to the capital and the Russian population centers. The Mexico comparison kind of works, but kind of doesn't, because it's also like not the East Coast that borders Mexico, which is the case with Ukraine and Russia. So, go ahead.
I also heard Gilbert Doctorow on the Scott Horton show recently. He was just saying that a part of what Putin is saying right now, which seems to be repeatedly truncated in the American press, is that if they're very serious about that being a red line, and then if that does happen, they'll move ships, or subs, or even commercial freighters into international waters, say 200 miles in the Atlantic and the Pacific, or the Pacific, off of away from America's coast, so that they can legally be there with hypersonics that can, reduce the amount of time that it would take for us to react, and you would have about like 5 to 7 minutes, say, before they could nuke an American city, which would be a total tit for tat sort of response. But yeah, I don't think that that's made as clear as it should be to Americans who think that they're just, that Russia's the bad guy and we've got to support Ukraine and democracy and all this.
Yep. So last two things on the talks, and we'll try to wrap up with some good news here, Connor. And that is they agreed to more working group talks between the U.S. and Russians, not, of course, between Biden and Putin, but maybe this could develop into something maybe as positive. It's better than them saying that we can't talk to each other anymore. We're just at ridiculous impasses. And that Sullivan described like not, they were asking about Putin's demeanor and everything like this, but the press corps that is. But what Sullivan described in the talks, which is probably the case, is that it was an actual conversation. It wasn't just the U.S. read their statement, the Russians read their statement, and nobody, like, there was apparently an actual conversation between Biden and Putin, and it was like maybe intense. It wasn't like friendly or anything like that, but it didn't resort to shout. There's no reports that resort to shouting or anything like that. So that's a little bit of good news. And
I think the New York Times even described it as like warm time, like at least in the beginning, like it started with Putin going, "Greetings, Mr. President," and Biden going, "Good to see you," and this kind of thing. So it doesn't sound like it was like akin to the talks Blinken had with Lavrov last week,
right,
where apparently it just boiled down to a screaming match.
Right. Well, before we wrap up here, Connor, just three more quick stories I want to mention. And that is the first with some talks in Vienna that actually happened last week between U.S. and Russian officials. They quietly apparently made a small breakthrough. No deal done yet. But as we've talked about on the show last week with Dave DeCamp, the number of U.S. Personnel in our embassies is rapidly shrinking. And there is a January 31st deadline where the U.S. and Russia are both set to expel a good chunk of the remaining diplomatic embassy or staff that are in each other's countries. And so with that coming up, there were some talks, and apparently there was a breakthrough, but it didn't say that they were prepared to enact it. And actually, one of the questions that Sullivan took at the presser seemed to suggest that they had not made a commitment or anything on this, but there was a question that was directed about the diplomatic missions. One interesting thing that I read apparently is that there is so few staff right now in the diplomatic embassy for the U.S. in Russia that the U.S. Ambassador or whoever, the head of the envoy, whatever, is learning how to buff floors and whatever, figure out what chemicals you need to dump in the toilets. Now, one of the bad things that I read actually is apparently the U.S. priority, once it does get more staff in its Moscow embassy, isn't to immediately pick up the diplomatic stuff, visa processing and all of that, but rather to work on some mechanical issues in the embassy, like fixing the elevator. Apparently they don't like stairs or something there. All right, last two stories, and I will make them quick. The Russian Putin traveled, I believe traveled, but had some kind of meeting, virtual or whatever, with the Indian President Modi, and it was apparently a very cordial and positive meeting, and they agreed to deepen their defense ties and that the Indians would move forward with their purchase of the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, which the U.S. has threatened to sanction various countries over, and we kicked the Turks out of the F-35 program over. And so I'm not sure what the U.S. is going to do about this now, but this was probably the last chance for the Indians to not be in violation of U.S. sanctions, and apparently they are going to start taking possession of that weapon system. Last thing to note here in Europe, and that is Finland is apparently decided to buy the F-35. They're going to spend $11.3 billion on the F-35, and they're going to phase out, I think, their F-18 Super Hornets is what they currently use in their military. Well, Connor, that was a lot to cover today, but a lot of important stuff. Everybody, check out Connor's article. You got the news of Russia and China on today's show, but he will give you the analysis, what's actually, going on behind the scenes, why everything's happening. Absolutely fantastic in that article. Check out libertarianinstitute.org. Connor's in the featured article sections. I do the news roundup and the show's on the homepage there. Everybody, thank you so much. If you're still listening, take a minute to share the show and follow Connor on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96, and I am at Kyle Anzalone _. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.